2025 has, let's make no mistake about it, been pretty rotten for Ukraine.
Thousands and thousands of flags are laid out in memory of those that have fallen fighting the full-scale Russian invasion. Now, this all coincidentally comes on the weekend before Trump's inauguration. The people here are saying they don't really imagine that Trump is going to make a whole lot of difference to their fight, and they are determined to fight on, though.
And it's been pretty bad for America's allies since the Trump administration came into office at the beginning of this year. The old relationships that have underpinned international security, certainly from a Western perspective, the very nature of NATO, the very foundations of international law have been completely upended.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
And this really was set off by an extraordinary meeting in the Oval Office between the global favorite and hero figure, President Volodymyr Zelensky, and President Donald Trump, the recently installed 47th US president, who, along with J.D. Vance and even members of the press, set about Zelensky in an act of schoolyard bullying, which will go down in history as one of the great and terrible crisis points.
You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's back to you, far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting?
Now, in saying that Zelensky had no cards to play and that he had brought the world closer to World War III, Donald Trump was echoing the position of the Kremlin, the words of Vladimir Putin coming out of the US president's mouth in many ways. Now, this is something that we were going to get used to over the course of the year. Now, all of this was combined with ongoing claims by the Trump administration and from Donald Trump himself that the United States has spent $350 billion on supporting Ukraine's, what he says, war against Russia, rather than the other way around, the defense of Ukraine against Russia.
And we've spent perhaps $350 billion, like taking candy from a baby. That's what happened. And they've spent $100 billion. What a difference that is. And we have an ocean separating us, and they don't.
He claimed that that was costing the US taxpayers $350 billion. It hadn't. It had actually cost about $120 billion, but he cut it off completely, cutting off Ukraine at the knees, making future plans for any kind of forward-moving assault, any plans to recapture territory that much harder, taking the Europeans completely off balance.
We don't just need peace among us, but to build a common defense. This is not to threaten or conquer, but to deter any attack from the outside driven by hatred against a united Europe. This is the task of our generation.
But what he also did was start to shift the debate away from how does Ukraine get help to win and on to how can Ukraine be persuaded or bullied into a position in which it accepts Russian levels of concessions, notably the loss of at least 20% of its territory. And this was followed up by Donald Trump putting pressure on Ukraine to agree to a range of minerals agreements that essentially gave the United States a dominant 50% share in all future profits in a post-war dispensation in terms of mineral exploitation inside Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians came under a lot of pressure for what they were told was been a mishandling of Donald Trump and have since been rather skilled in their Trump whispering, making sure that the relationship with the White House never actually broke down, even though the relationship with other countries in Europe was getting worse and worse. Now, in shifting that conversation towards a ceasefire, out on the front lines, this was received extremely badly, and one of the best exponents of quite how badly it was being received was an American medic I met. She's a battalion commander in an infantry brigade in charge of medical facilities. And this is the kind of thing that she was absolutely rejecting, any kind of a sense that the Ukrainians could trust the Russians at all.
Would you welcome a ceasefire?
I don't think a ceasefire will be honored. I don't think a ceasefire will be honored. I would absolutely love the chance to get my wounded guys out, for them to have some rest and respite. But based on history and based on Russia's proven behavior over and over again, I can't even fathom a world in which a ceasefire was actually honored. And I actually told the guys, I said, I will stay right here and I will be the first to report if they violate it. And I will report it live. And I will say, as an American on the ground in Ukraine, I can tell you, because God knows that it has to be verified and credentialed if a Ukrainian says it. I can tell you right now, I am experiencing an attack that is from Russia during a mandated, signed ceasefire.
As they have done in the past. Here.
Yes.
Not very far.
Rebecca was stationed running medical evacuations and running medical supplies around about here into these areas, which were becoming extremely dangerous. And this is the first sense we really started to get of how drone warfare had completely transformed the whole battle space in Ukraine. And that means that only two nations on earth are really expert in this, and that is the Russians and the Ukrainians. But it was Rebecca's revelations of how she was conducting support to soldiers trapped there that was so startling.
I don't think anyone can be prepared for a conflict like this. I don't think anyone can. And what's concerning to me is, while they're offering these trainings, which I'm very grateful for, like these allied forces are offering trainings to the Ukrainians, I think it would do them well to also take some information and training from the Ukrainians.
What was also striking in those early months at the beginning of this year, in February, March, April, on visits to Ukraine, was that the Ukrainians were by no means on the back foot. The Russian economy was suffering. The Russian military was not making any significant progress, and it was clear that level of pressure had to be increased from the Russian perspective on the Ukrainians, and that's what Donald Trump set about doing. But as an example of just how well the Ukrainians were doing in spite of very limited levels of support from the West, we went down to Odessa and took a look down here, out of this port here, on what was going on across the Black Sea. Now, it would have been suicidal to have taken aboard a Ukrainian ship 6 months or 9 months prior to that. There were only about 4 surface vessels that were actually crewed left in Ukraine's navy after it was destroyed and scuppered at Sebastopol when the Russians moved in there. But they had managed to completely dominate the Black Sea. There were no significant Russian presences on that Black Sea at all. There were no Russian naval ships that would dare take to sea.
This is an island-class patrol boat, originally a British design, designed to fight the Cod Wars, protecting British fisheries. It's now in the Black Sea, very much in the front line of the defence of Ukrainian territory. Last night, indeed, it was in action against Shahed drones trying to hit the port and the city of Odessa. But it's also been an integral part of the dominance now of the Ukrainian Navy over the Black Sea.
We are under attack every day. Yeah, because we don't know to what point, what final destination of every Shahed 136. We say we don't need to have a fleet for destroying the Russian fleet. We have the very, very smart guys who create the sea drones. The sea drones and the missiles. So that's how we did that.
And all of this was a consequence of the rapid development by the Ukrainians of alternative methods of fighting, because they were still fighting effectively with one hand tied behind the backs. Russians had enjoyed the sight of the United States cutting off military supplies to the Ukrainians. They were still enjoying a degree of protection even from the Europeans, in that there were restrictions in place at the beginning of this year that prevented the Ukrainians from striking deep into Russian territory to go after those logistics nodes that they needed to be able to attack in order to stop the Russian campaigning continuing inside their own country, essentially to cut off the oil and other supplies into their country. And they were doing that in the south, in Odessa. But at the same time, the Russians were striking back, particularly here in Kherson. This green area is all an area that was liberated from Russian occupation by the Ukrainians in the summer of 2023, when they counterattacked overstretched Russian forces. But now the Russians are all based on that southern edge of the river and using those bases there to go on what the Ukrainians and the Russians were describing as safaris, hunting safaris, where they were killing civilians and training on drones to kill civilians inside the city of Kherson. Now back in the hands of Ukrainians, many of whom, including entire hospitals, have been forced underground. And who have we got here? Who's the baby?
Дівчинка, звати Аделіна. Вчора народилась у нас донька.
Yesterday? Wow. How was it for you to be giving birth underground in a town that is being attacked by Russian bombs and drones?
Ну, почнемо з того, що ми народжуємо дитинку, щастя, яке ми носимо його під нашим сердечком. Тому, ну, звичайно, страшно трішечки, але, ну, воно того варте, якщо чесно. Оце щастя, такий комочок, який ти тримаєш на ручках, і, ну.
And you didn't want to leave even with all of the attacks from the Russians?
Виїхати маєте на увазі? Ну, ні, ну, поки ні, ну, не було такого.
4:45 in the evening, we've been in the hospital for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. In that time, the very small number of people who were on the streets of Kherson, 1 or 2 people on bicycles, others perhaps shopping, but in tiny numbers, have now completely vanished. Now, in the north of the country, the Ukrainians at the beginning of the year held an area sort of like that inside Russia, a salient inside the Russian province of Kursk, which had caused great embarrassment to the Putin administration. The Ukrainians captured it at some considerable cost, but the Russians desperately wanted it back. Now, they got help from 2 different quarters for this. The first was North Korea, who sent many hundreds of special forces troops who were extremely reluctant to ever face capture and fought extremely ferociously on the side of the Russians. And at the same time, the Americans blinded the Ukrainian intelligence feed. They literally blacked it out, which meant that the Russians could move and attack with far greater impunity, and the intelligence feed that had been so critical to the defense of their country up until now, that was coming from the United States, was suspended by the United States at the same time as Moscow launched their assault into Kursk. And ultimately, they were successful. This darker area here is the only area still held by the Ukrainians inside Russia, just inside the border there.
Ви хочете повернутися назад в Північну Корею?
북한으로 다시 돌아가고 싶어? 조선으로 다시 돌아가고 싶어?
Так.
But one cannot underestimate the level of fanaticism that the North Korean soldiers were essentially, one supposes, forced to adopt. But outside of North Korea, they had not been deployed for many, many years since they were used in significant numbers to support Robert Mugabe many decades ago. But these were fanatical troops who really didn't want to risk surrender.
Але що ви воюєте проти України?
우크라이나 상대로 싸우는 거 알고 있었지. 몰랐어?
Не знав. А що вам казали ваші командири, коли відправляли на війну?
그러면 여기 지휘관들 모자는 뭐라고 그랬어? 누구랑 싸운다고 했어?
훈련을 실전처럼 해본다고 했어요.
Йому казали, що просто тренування.
북한의 가족들이 없어? 있어?
Родина є. Вони знають, де ви зараз?
부모님은 지금 너 어디 있는지 알아?
As the year wore on from summer into autumn, the Russians redoubled their efforts, rapidly improving their capacity to use drones, particularly ones guided by fiber optics, which made them much harder for the Ukrainians to jam. And they threw more and more men into the fight, particularly in areas around here, as they attempted to get in close to Kursk. They also were forcing the Ukrainians onto the back foot further south and down due south of Zaporizhia, the scene of where there is a nuclear power station, a Ukrainian nuclear power station, still in the hands of the Russians. And if we speed up the feed that has come on a daily basis from the deep state mapping system, one can see just how much territory the Russians have managed to regain over the last year. And frankly, it's not much, and it has been at a gigantic cost. The estimated casualties for the Russians is now well over 1 million killed and injured. And I know from speaking to soldiers on the front lines that whilst they were killing Russians in industrial quantities before the drone warfare got underway, when the Russians throw large numbers of troops into, for example, the battle to try to capture Kursk, they are still losing many hundreds, even possibly up to 1,000 a week. Now, that is something that gives the Russians an edge. They do have the weight of numbers, but the Ukrainians are pretty convinced that they can ultimately perhaps outlast the Russians. Whilst the Ukrainians have been restricted in what kind of weapons supplied by NATO can be used to strike inside Russia, they have developed their own deep strike capability, medium-range cruise missiles and long-range cruise missiles capable, in the case of the Flamingo, of reaching some 3,000 miles deep into Russian territory, carrying a ton of high explosives. Others have much shorter ranges, but they have been used to very specifically target the Russian oil industry infrastructure.
We do work on putting real sanctions on Russian economy.
You put real sanctions on the Russian economy by blowing it up?
Kind of.
And at the same time, the Ukrainians pulled off the most extraordinarily daring and successful intelligence operation using not long-range drones, but short-range drones deployed in trucks right across the Russian Federation, many thousands of miles from the front line, again to attack critical infrastructure and the air force of the Russians in what was called Operation Spiderweb. Most of the drone warfare is conducted at night because in daylight it's much easier to use drones, but much harder to escape them. And so any kind of movement by infantry is at night. So that is a prime hunting period. I joined a group of Ukrainian drone pilots in their bunker on the front line south of Zaporizhia. Now, the front lines are now 10 to 15 kilometers deep, with the grey zone in the middle, the right in the center of it. Not the scene of ferocious fighting, but the scene of unspeakable fear and agony as small groups of Ukrainian and Russian troops flit around the blasted ruins of the battlescape, hoping against hope to escape drone killers. That was an outgoing artillery round that had just been fired as I came down into this bunker. This is the bunker from which this team has been working now for many weeks, as it has been attacking a number of different Russian targets every single night. They've got about an hour, they say, before they're going to start up again. And they've got a target list of 5 identified targets that they've got to attack. But they've also said, of course, that there are targets of opportunity, and also if there are infantry attacks, then they have to be switched. They have to move from the set task onto the task that they've got to react to.
There's bombs for first
sortie. First operation.
First operation, yes.
What have you got there? 2 bombs? 1 bomb? 2 bombs?
8 kilograms and 5 kilograms.
High explosive and penetration.
Yes, yes, yes.
Where there's soldiers, there's always tea.
Ah, shit.
They know that every second they're above ground, they could be killed by men who are just like them. They're within Russian drone, artillery and mortar range, and they're prime targets. Ramzan loads the bombs under the Typhoon. He removes the detonator safety pins. Avi's the pilot. Ukraine's own jamming system catches the drone and almost blinds it, and now it has to be flown back and landed. The drone is landing so close that it can be heard inside the bunker, and it's got 2 live bombs on board. Do you enjoy that?
No. We have difficulties with the compass. Our drone on the map make 360s, but on the camera it stays still. So I don't know what happened.
But soon another bunker is to get hit in Kamyansky. Avi checks the coordinates and searches for his target. He thinks he has it. Bombs away. Are you happy with that?
Yes.
Why?
Yes. Because target is...
But while all of this has been going on, the diplomatic debate has been intense, with the Americans consistently trying to argue a Russian position, which is that much of the east of Ukrainian-held territory should be handed over to Russia as part of any new dispensation. Americans think that the Russians should be given is what is known as the Fortress Belt, and that is an area of territory essentially that runs down like this, that is Ukrainian-held, where very strong fortresses and defences have been built in order to prevent any further Russian advances through those front lines. But at the same time, if we look further south, we can also see the other areas that the Russians covered, and that's all of Kherson and probably Odessa too. It is absolutely clear, with an increase in attacks on Odessa over the later few months in December, that that is a prime target for the Russians. Entirely falsely, Donald Trump claims to have brought peace in some 8 conflicts around the globe.
We ended 8 wars. Think of that. 8 wars, but we're going to do one more, I think. I hope. Every time I end a war, they say if President Trump ends that war, he's going to get the Nobel Prize.
He hasn't, but part of his attempts, we now know failed attempts to win a Nobel Peace Prize, included inviting Vladimir Putin, an indicted war criminal under the International Criminal Court, wanted for crimes against humanity committed allegedly in Ukraine. He was invited to US territory, to Anchorage in Alaska, to meet with the US president. The meetings did not go well, but that didn't in the end result in a dilution of American support for Russia's position on Ukraine. There were signs at one point that perhaps Donald Trump might give the Ukrainians some Tomahawk missiles to enable them to continue their deep strike operations against Russia. But we know from transcripts of a conversation leaked between Steve Witkoff and the chief foreign advisor to Vladimir Putin, in which he coached the Russians in how to essentially manipulate Donald Trump against the Ukrainian position shortly before another Oval Office meeting between the Ukrainian president and the US president resulted in no Tomahawks for the Ukrainians, much to the surprise of Kyiv and her supporters. Now, this was orchestrated by Steve Witkoff, who British intelligence officials now call Dim Philby. And that is because he and the Americans are simply not trusted to be reliable Western allies in this conversation that they are leading when it comes to Ukraine, because they've successfully shifted the conversation away from how to get the Ukrainians into a position of victory to one in which how Ukrainians can be persuaded to give the Russians a pretty hefty chunk of their territory. This is unacceptable both to the Ukrainians and to most of the European leaders within the European Union, but also wider NATO members such as the United Kingdom and Canada. In the case of Canada, Donald Trump has suggested he might do a Putin on Canadian territory, since he believes that land mass should be another US state, not an independent nation.
Marriage, because it's two places that get along very well. They like each other a lot.
Well, if I may, as you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
Now, when it comes to these sort of statements from Donald Trump, the experience over 2025 is that when he makes these sorts of statements, and he's made similar ones about ground troops perhaps invading Venezuela, where he's got a flotilla of ships led by the world's biggest aircraft carrier now parked in the sea just off the coast of Venezuela, and where he's conducting extrajudicial execution missions against alleged drug smugglers. He may well make good on his threats to sending ground troops. And Nicolas Maduro over there has said that he would resist every attempt at regime change, even though the population of Venezuela may well welcome an end to the Maduro rule. They certainly wouldn't welcome an American invasion in the way that the Ukrainians have continued to resist Russian invading forces, but now with a much more substantial help from the Europeans, who are contributing some 250 billion euros so far to the Ukrainian war effort. There is an additional $90 billion worth of loans based around Russian funds that the Europeans are making available to the Ukrainians, because from the European perspective, this could be an existential war.
I warned that what is happening in Ukraine could happen to allied countries too, that we had to shift to a wartime mindset.
And it's at midway point against Russia, not the end.